It's the amazing Rico Brogna podcast with your host, Evan Roberts.
It is Rico Brogna. Welcome to another brand new edition of the Rico Brogna. I went back into the archives because I was curious. This is one of the longest layoffs we've ever had from Rico's. The last live Rico Brogna we had was Tuesday, and it was amazing. So we were doing this live episode, and as the episode was going on, I started to lose my voice. It was very peculiar if you were listening to it. I was also losing my mind. Two things were happening at the same time. Voice was going away, mind was going away, right? If you listened early in the episode, I completely got Andy Martino's Roki Sasaki story completely backwards. That was sign number one that my brain was going. And then my voice started going. And I was like, all right, I guess I should go to bed. Woke up the next morning, felt like crap. And my wife said, you should give yourself a COVID test because my in-laws live with me. We got to be extra safe. And I got COVID. And all of a sudden, here I am 5 days later. I was able to be on the radio for a few days, and those were important days, which we'll get to. But it has been a while since we've done a Rico. It's good to be back. Let's talk about the latest around Pete Alonso, because Jim Duquette's exclusive, if you will, about the change in philosophy coming from Scott Boras is monstrous. It is a monstrous development, because the way I have viewed the Pete Alonso negotiation, and this isn't my opinion, because my opinion has always been bring him back. And I would have said to you, give him a 5-year contract. I would have said dumb things, and I have said dumb things about just getting it done to bring Pete back. But watching this offseason unfold, clearly the Mets have been waiting on Pete Alonso and Scott Boras to come back down to earth. They wanted a long-term contract, rightfully so. Why wouldn't you go into free agency looking for a long-term contract? And the Mets sat there basically saying, show us what you got. If you can get a big-time offer from another team, great. Come back to us, show us what you got. Maybe we'll match it. Maybe we won't match it, and you'll end up as a member of the Angels or the Giants or the Cubs or wherever. And so as this was happening over the last few months, and you saw names coming off the board, specifically Juan Soto to us, and then all the first basemen that came off the board, what I've said here on the Rico is that it's probably going to take a while for Scott Boras and Pete Alonso to realize there isn't a 6-year contract. There isn't a 5-year contract. There may not even be a 4-year contract. And based on Scott Boras's history, he wouldn't come to the conclusion of, I should settle on a pillow contract until March. And that's why I've warned my fellow Met fans, whether it's on WFAN or here on the Rico, it's going to be a while. What I didn't see coming is Scott Boras realizing maybe I shouldn't wait until March. Maybe I shouldn't wait until February. And he's smart to realize he shouldn't wait that long. Because ask yourself this, if you're Scott Boras and you're Pete Alonso, knowing that all the first basemen have come off the market, knowing that a lot of the big bats have come off the market, knowing that some teams that you thought may be interested in you would no longer be interested in you because they have filled the position. Knowing all of that, what's going to change between now and March when the pressure is greater on you from your client to just get a deal done? Because if you're sitting here in late February and then you finally realize, okay, we're not getting the 5 or 6 year deal, let's negotiate some pillow contracts. You've got a client who's probably saying, hey, I kind of want to get to camp. I don't want to show up 2 weeks late. That's not ideal. That's not best for a player going into a pillow contract, right? Because if you're going to have to settle for a short-term deal, the hope as a player is that you're going to have a monster year. Well, take a look at what happened to Jordan Montgomery last year. And I get it's different. We're talking about a pitcher versus a slugger. But nevertheless, his pillow contract got ruined in year one because he had a terrible year. So what I'm glad to see, if you believe Jim Duquette's reporting, and why wouldn't you, that Scott Boras went to the Mets and said, all right, let's negotiate a short-term contract. Let's negotiate a big AAV 3-year deal. Actually makes a lot of sense if you're Scott Boras, because nothing was going to change, right? Think about this from his perspective and Pete's perspective. What was going to change between now and March when you were going to have to get off the 5 or 6 year ask anyway? So I commend Boras if this is true, because I think he's got a better chance at negotiating a good contract by doing it now. Now, let me get to the Mets side of things. I know that we've had a lot of arguments through emails, through voicemails, over not just the last few months, but the last year regarding Pete Alonso. Some saying, Evan, you're a fanboy. You want Pete too much. You're putting the homegrownness too high on the totem pole. You shouldn't want Pete Alonso back on a 5-year, $150 million deal. Well, here's the good news. The good news is the 5-year deals are gone now. The 6-year deals are gone now. There's no more arguments about long-term contracts. So now this comes down to the New York Mets agreeing on a shortish-term opt-out laden deal with Scott Boras and with Pete Alonso. And what I ask anyone who is against keeping Pete Alonso, now that we've entered small 2-3 year package territory, why would you be against it now? Isn't this exactly what David Stearns wanted? Isn't this exactly what some of you wanted? The risk has now been, taken away. So the way I view this from a Met perspective is the pressure is now on them. They've got to get a deal done because average annual salary, and I think that's what they're negotiating now, if the Mets and Scott Boras are exclusively talking about 3-year deals, 2-year deals with opt-outs, clearly the negotiation is going to be AAV. Scott may be asking for $50 million a year for all we know. But a short-term deal is exactly in the David Stearns wheelhouse, exactly in the Mets wheelhouse. There are so many reasons why, in my opinion, the pressure is more on the New York Mets today than it was a week ago. Because a week ago, if someone gave him a 5 or 6 year contract, you could talk me off the ledge and say, come on, Evan, it wouldn't have been smart business to give a guy who's 30 years old, who's been declining the last 3 years, who we're not sure how is going to age. It wouldn't have been smart to give that guy a 5-year deal. I've had that argument for a while with a lot of you guys. But now that we're off that, and now that we're only talking about short-term deals, what would be the negative? So I think the pressure now is on David Stearns and Steve Cohen to get a deal done. Because think about this other factor here, right? If Scott Boras is now exclusively saying to the Mets, let's work out a short-term pillowed contract. And I get Scott's going to initially ask for an obscene amount of money in year one, right? He's going to say, all right, 3-year deal, $145 million, something crazy. And I get arguing against why you wouldn't want to give Pete Alonso $50 million a year. But if Scott includes other teams, if he says, all right, Mets, I gave you a week. We couldn't come to a deal on a short-term deal. I'm going to go elsewhere. Why would other teams, when Pete Alonso, remember, turned down the qualifying offer, so you have to give up a draft pick to get him. Why are you giving up a draft pick on a short-term deal? You would think that would hurt his value even more. And look, a part of the appeal of a Pete Alonso or others, and we'll get to some of the others later on in the pod, accepting a short-term deal is so that they can rid themselves of the qualifying offer. You can only be offered the QO one time. So if you're Pete Alonso or Scott Boras and you're thinking that the qualifying offer is hurting you, another reason why the pillow contract is so good is have a big year, opt out. There's no qualifying offer attached to you. So now it's strictly about teams giving you the money and giving you the years you want and not worrying about draft pick compensation. But the Mets are the one team that would be negotiating with Pete Alonso that would not have to worry today about giving up a draft pick. Would not matter at all. So you would think that gives the Mets another advantage. But you don't want to have other teams negotiating against you. This is, to me, an important week for the Mets and David Stearns to just get this thing done. Get it done. And who cares how high the AAV is? Now we're just talking about a tax that Steve Cohen has to pay for 1 year, maybe 2 years. That's it. And what the Mets have shown you, and Steve has shown us, is that they're not concerned about high AAVs. So this, to me, if it's all true, and I do believe it's true, just based on the logic of where this market is going. And maybe Scott Boras, even though he'll never admit it, learning from the mistakes he made last year. He made mistakes letting this thing go all the way until March. It's not good because even though there are no deadlines in Major League Baseball, all of a sudden you have itchy clients. You've got clients when it's late February probably calling you a little bit more often saying, hey, what's going on? Hey, what should I do? Where should I go? And now you've got players out of their routine. And ultimately, when you know you have to settle for a pillow contract, you want to put your client in the best position to have a big year so that when they have a big year and they opt out, you get them the most money. And for Pete Alonso, and I don't know if he knows this, I'm certainly surmising this is the case. Maybe this is me as a Met fan talking myself into it. He has a better chance to have a big year in another contract year with the New York Mets than he does anywhere else. You are now in a lineup with Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor and Mark Vientos coming off a big year. And more than even all that stuff, the lineup stuff, you're familiar with the locker room. You're familiar with the city. You're familiar with the stadium. You're familiar with your living arrangements. On a short-term deal in San Francisco, a short-term deal in Las Vegas. I know they're not even being considered. They're not even in Las Vegas. In Sacramento with the A's, or a short-term deal with the Angels. You're probably not having as good of a year. You're not in as comfortable of a situation. So it behooves Pete Alonso, it behooves Scott Boras, and you damn right it behooves the Mets to get this thing done. Now, Pete Hoffman has said something that has driven me nuts over the last few weeks. You have said there's a part of you that thinks they don't actually want him back. Well, here's what I'll tell you, bro. If they don't bring him back now on this kind of short-term pillowed contract, then you'll be proven right. Because the short-term deal, even if it's a bloated AAV, is right up this team's alley. So I'm not saying it better be done in 5 days or they don't want him back, because this is a staring contest. It is a negotiation. But if they lose him on a short-term deal, then I put that on the New York Mets. And I think it would be a major mistake.
I 100% agree with you on that. I'm a little bit more like impatient and I want to see this happen tomorrow because, like, hey, this is what you've asked for. Like you said, David Stern's all up in his alley. But here's the other thing, too. Like, we're talking about can't miss. Even if you want to bring the AAV down and be like, listen, I know you want $150 million for 3 years. We don't want to do that. But you know what we can do? We can give you a freaking signing bonus, okay? Because we've done that before, and that's a new thing now. You can give signing bonuses to people. So we could bring the AAV down by still giving you 30 to 35 mil a year. So it's not this crazy over-the-top contract, and give you a bonus. And we can defer some money. We can give some incentives. We can get all creative for the next 3 years. There's so many options. So you're right. If for some reason this doesn't get signed, it's the Mets' fault. It's David Stern's. And I'm not saying it's their fault, but I'm just saying they're the reason why it wouldn't get done.
Well, yeah, I think that if he had gotten the big contract elsewhere, the 5-year deal, the 4-year deal, I think that while I would probably still argue with a lot of my fellow Met fans, you could understand hey, got a better offer elsewhere, and the Mets didn't want to go to a 4th or 5th year. They look at his age. They look at him possibly breaking down, even though he hasn't broken down, but his skills kind of going down over the next few years. And they made a decision that they weren't comfortable going 4 or 5 years. That doesn't appear to be the case anymore. This appears to be a short-term, big money deal. And keep this in mind, because there's a report that came out within the last hour or two from The Athletic about other sluggers, including Anthony Santander, that Anthony Santander may now consider a short-term contract, that a lot of the remaining free agents are going to consider these pillow contracts. And maybe what agents, including Scott Boras, are learning is that it's better for your client to start considering this stuff now than in February or March. It's not ideal to take this thing into spring training and to take this thing when you are facing like not a real deadline, but sort of a deadline. Like you saw what happened to JD Martinez last year when he signed. He wasn't even ready for the start of the year. But the reason I bring that up is Anthony Santander on a short-term contract is a backup plan for Pete Alonso. He is, because, we think sometimes about first base squarely or third base if they move Vientos. It's replacing the power of Pete, and maybe you get that power out of DH. They did make an offer to Teoscar Hernandez, and while we were trying to play the mental gymnastics of figuring out, okay, where was he going to play, the answer is really DH, because the Mets don't have a DH right now. So if they lost Pete Alonso, their thought could be, all right, we're going to internally replace the first baseman with Vientos and let's say Beatty at third base, but we're going to go big at DH, and that's where we're going to get the production. All right, here's the negative to this, even though Santander is a switch hitter and he had a really good year last year. He turned down the qualifying offer. So you're giving up a draft pick that you would not have to give up in the case of Pete Alonso for a similar short-term big AAV contract, and you're talking about a player that's never played here before. So before we even crunch the numbers comparing Santander to Alonso, factor in the draft pick. Is that really something you want to give up? So I would prefer to keep Pete as opposed to replacing Pete with Santander, which I think is a backup option if they lost Alonso.
Listen, Santander would be a nice addition to Pete Alonso. We've been talking about this for a while, that it's not just one bat, we need two. So I would take both. And clearly, if you got Pete, then I'm more willing to go ahead and give up a draft pick for Santander, because it's a luxury.
But by the way, and this is the next argument in Rico land and in Met land, I don't think they necessarily need a second bat. I could sell myself, and I don't really have to work that hard to sell myself on this, because it's one of those things where if they got a second bat, great. I'm not going to complain about it. It's a deeper lineup. You have more established bats in your lineup. But if you bring back Pete Alonso, okay, you just bring him back. The other bat that you can add, and I'd be good with, is just literally bringing Jesse Winker back. And I would feel good with that. I would feel good going into this upcoming season with obviously the infield being intact with Pete Alonso. Second base, I guess as of now, it's just Jeff McNeil coming back. There's been no development on any kind of McNeil trade. Lindor at short, Vientos at third base. And I would consider my DH Jesse Winker, Starling Marte, who's still here, Brett Beatty, who I think would be in the mix. And then obviously center field would be Siri and Taylor and maybe Luis Angel Acuna and eventually Jet Williams. I'm fine with that. Now, I'm certainly not going to complain if you went out and added Anthony Santander to go along with Pete, but I don't think it's necessarily a must. The must is having the big bat retained in Alonso, but if it's not Alonso, going out and getting Santander is just not as good, especially when you factor in giving up the draft pick that you'd have to give up.
And I just want to say one thing about Pete Alonso too, that I know that a lot of people think that the big mistake by Pete Alonso going into the regular season was getting Scott Boras to be his agent. That took a hit, especially considering the year prior, Blake Snell had a bad offseason. Jordan Montgomery had a bad offseason. Matt Chapman had a bad offseason. But besides Montgomery, look what Chapman did. Chapman signed a 3-year, $54 million deal, but then signed an extension.
Yeah.
Got his money. Blake Snell got the opt-out and then got his money with the Dodgers. I'm telling you right now, we could say, this was the biggest mistake for Pete Alonso. But if it's about the money for Pete Alonso, Scott Boras is going to find a way to get it, whether it's going to be this year or maybe next year.
And here's the reality. And I know you don't want to hear this, and I don't even want to hear this, but I'm trying to evaluate things in a very fair way. We may get Pete back on a short-term deal. The idea he's going to be a lifelong New York Met right now feels remote. This ending with him playing his entire career with the New York Mets doesn't feel like a very likely scenario. Now, that's for down the road. That's for an off-season Rico next year. We'll worry about it then, but if you're asking me right now, I'm starting to rack my brain how could this ever even finish with Pete being a New York Met, not just next year, but the year after, the year after, the year after that. It doesn't seem like a likely scenario, but as of right now, what I'm thinking about is 2025. That's what I'm thinking about, and how Pete Alonso gives the Mets the best chance to win in 2025.
Oh, wait, you're not thinking about Vlad Guerrero Jr. next year?
Not
I mean,
now. I'm not.
That's the argument I get. Why don't the Mets just go for Vlad Guerrero? What's the like? He's the better player. This and that. Just trade for him. First of all, we just talked about we don't want to give up a draft pick for Anthony Santander, but we're sitting here talking about, oh, you know what? Why don't we give up some draft picks for a 1-year rental of Vlad Guerrero Jr.?
Well, first of all, there is no Vladimir Guerrero Jr. trade available. Like, that's the thing people have to. The Blue Jays are not trading Vlad Guerrero Jr. right now. If they were, this would be very different. But they're not trading him right now. They would trade him at the trade deadline. And I'll tell you right now, I don't think that's likely either, because the American League is the freaking junior varsity. And the Blue Jays could accidentally find themselves in a pennant race in the American League. So, yes, he's a free agent. He is, just like Kyle Tucker's a free agent, just like others are free agents. And when we do Rico's next year, which we will, I'm sure his name will be discussed. But in terms of helping the Mets in 2025, he's not available. So that's why this Alonso pillow deal is the best for everybody. It's the best for even those that want to move on from him. Because if you get him on this kind of contract and he opts out, maybe you move on. And by the way, maybe I'm saying something different a year from now. We're talking about this right now in January of 2025 when Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is not available. Now, let me get to some of your emails because we got a lot of people chiming in on the news over the last few days. The reports coming from Jim Duquette that Scott Boras has exclusively told the Mets, hey, let's negotiate a short-term contract. The other thing I do want to point out before I start reading these emails, and I don't believe in coincidences, maybe you do, but on Thursday's Evan and Tiki show, during the Open, Tiki Barber, as a New York athlete, gave his friendly advice to Pete Alonso, which was simply, look, you get more money, you have every right to go elsewhere, but understand the value of being a lifelong New York athlete. And he certainly comes from a place of experience. If Tiki Barber left as a free agent in 2002 and he signed in Tampa Bay, I don't think he's doing afternoon drive in New York City. I don't think he's the beloved giant player that he is. So there is a value to it, and he certainly speaks from a place of experience. David Wright met the media a few days ago and talking about his number being retired and talked about the same thing. So Tiki does that lecture, and then the next day, the Duquette report comes out. It's almost like it got to Pete, that David Wright and Tiki Barber's advice got to Alonso of, oh, crap, man, maybe I don't want to leave. All right, let's get to some of your emails. Let me start this off with Ryan. Ryan writes, Evan, love the podcast and you and Tiki, but I've got two major gripes with something you said the other day on WFAN while talking about Pete's legacy with the New York Mets. Number one, you argued Pete wouldn't be beloved and appreciated anywhere else the same as he is here. Are you serious? 99% of Met fans wanted Pete gone 2 weeks before the season ultimately ended. They turned on him en masse. He has to remember that. Okay, so Pete Alonso, upon his early struggles in the postseason against Milwaukee, upon his massive struggles in September, while the Mets were sort of halfway collapsing, upon dropping a pop-up in a winner-take-all game 3, yes, got a lot of Met fans on social media to basically say he stinks, they should trade him. Well, not trade him. It's too late for that. They should let him go as a free agent. He can't get a big hit. But remember what that echo chamber is. That echo chamber is social media. People aren't going up to Pete Alonso in the street and saying you suck. Pete Alonso wasn't being booed at Citi Field. So when you say he remembers that, I don't think he remembers anything. I don't think he's sitting here listening to Met podcasts and listening to individual Met fans turn on him for not getting big hits in September. So I think, number one, you are blowing up what Pete heard in September and what he heard for a couple of days in October before he hit one of the biggest home runs in the history of the New York Mets. So disagree there. Number two, you said if the money was anywhere near the same, he should stay for the sake of signings, appearances, because he'll make that money. I'm sorry, but if the Mets offer him 3 years, 90, and another team offers him 3 years, 105, a negligible difference, you're telling me he's going to make up $15 million in signings and appearances? Pete should take the most money no matter how much and where it is. Hell, Juan Soto did it. No, what I am saying about Pete Alonso is that, and this is not even, look, Pete could do whatever he wants. He wants to take every last dime. He doesn't care about being a Met. That's fine. I'm not going to hold bitterness towards him for that. He has every right to. What I'm going to explain right now is, I think, a fact. If Pete Alonso leaves to sign with the Angels or the Giants or wherever, it is likelier than not that he's just any other guy that probably bounces around the league, has a nice career, and can go home and live happy. And there's nothing wrong with that. But he will never go somewhere else and become a legend for that team. He'll never go somewhere else and have it be talked about his number being retired. He'll never go anywhere else and come back years later as a returning hero. That is very unlikely to happen. If he is a career New York Met, and dare I say, is a part of a team that wins a world championship, Pete Alonso may come back 20 years from now with his number retired. If Pete Alonso ends up hitting 450 home runs, even if he doesn't go to the Hall of Fame, and he's a lifelong Met, there's a really good chance his number is retired. There's a really good chance he comes back to every old-timers day with a standing ovation. There's a chance he lives as maybe not the Met icon. I'm not saying he's going to pass Tom Seaver, but as a Met legend. Now, that may not mean anything to him, and that's fine. Doesn't have to. But that was my point about the difference between staying here and leaving. And if the money is significantly different, then go fine, go leave. That's okay. But all I'm explaining is understand the difference in the way you're viewed. And think about the way he'd be viewed by Met fans. If Pete Alonso leaves, I don't think he'll ever be hated. This isn't a you're dead to us Saquon situation. No one's suggesting that. I think he just becomes like whatever in Met history. Just like, he played for the Mets. It's not the same example, but I'll give you a guy who we now shrug about when we think about in Met history. And that guy is Todd Hundley. Todd Hundley was the best player on the Mets for a number of years. He broke that catching home run record, and no fault of his own, he got hurt. It opened up the possibilities of bringing in Mike Piazza, and they tried to coexist. It didn't work with Todd Hundley playing left field, and before you know it, Hundley was gone. And he bounced around the league, and you forgot about him. We all forgot about him. You don't see Todd Hundley jerseys around Citi Field anymore. So if Pete leaves, again, different circumstances, you'll remember him, but I don't think he could live in Met history the way he could if he stays. But again, completely up to him. Sammy from Dubai writes, I'm starting to have deja vu with the Pete Alonso thing. We all remember how Scott Boras wrecked Michael Conforto's career and how Conforto was out of baseball for an entire season. I hope Pete is smarter than Conforto and will not allow this overrated super agent to wreck his career. The Conforto thing is very different. He was hurt, and that kind of screwed him up in free agency, which is why he missed a year. I don't think an agent can ruin a guy's career. The agent can supply the player with decisions to make, and I just laid out the positives and the negatives of being here and not being here. It's up to him, especially if the numbers are similar. But I think Pete Alonso and the future of his career is just based on, is he going to be able to stay healthy, which he has his entire career? And is this trend over the last few years of him declining something that's going to continue? Like, I love Pete Alonso, but I can't sit here and deny the fact that over the last 3 years, his numbers have gone backwards. I'd be lying to you. I'm not going to lie to you about that. I mean, you look at his numbers last year, his home run percentage went way down. You look at him over the last 3 years, his OPS goes down every single year. So is that something that continues off of a cliff? And by the way, if it does, then those opt-outs aren't going to do him a damn thing. Because if he continues to decline, whatever 3-year or 2-year contract he ends up with, that's going to be the contract. Look at Cody Bellinger. He didn't opt out after 1 year. You needed to put up the right numbers to opt out after 1 year. Kendrick writes, Evan, swingers may be synonymous with pineapples, but power swingers are known for home run apples. And I think we're in the midst of a baseball power swinging saga. Tiki deserves all the credit. Literally 100% of the credit when Pete returns. There's not 1 ounce or follicle of your beard that deserves recognition when Pete resigns. But I do think you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Alonso and Boras came to the Mets the day after Vlad and the Jays agreed to his arbitration number. Pete and Boras realized Vlad will reset the first base market next year, and if the Jays retain him, they, Pete and Boras, can opt out and gain leverage. But if Toronto loses Vlad to the Mets, surely the Jays will need to replace him, and this is where our power swingers are swapped. So although in the short term it seems like Pete will be back for opening day 2025, don't be surprised when that home run apple goes up and signals to a certain player in the league, not only are we taking care of business, but we're open for business too. We are now in the Soto era, and Pete is here for a good time, not a long time. Kendrick. That's a tremendous email, Kendrick. And I kind of happen to agree with you about a lot of what you said. And I alluded to this earlier that there is no part of me that sits here and thinks on this middle of January, Saturday night, as we record live in between football games, there's no part of me that thinks Pete's going to retire as a Met. Like, I think that dream is floating away. And I don't say that with a smile because, look, ultimately, while I would love for Pete Alonso to be a lifelong Met, and I would love for the homegrown Met to break every record he could, I want to win. Right? That's the number one thing for all of us. I want to win. We all want to win. And when we're sitting here a year from now, and who knows what next season looks like, there is a decent chance, I'm going to be saying into this microphone, their best chance of winning is letting Pete go after he opts out and Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is available or Kyle Tucker's available, and we're talking about moving Juan Soto to first base. I have no idea. But I think that while there are so many things that can happen between now and next year, I do agree that him signing a short-term contract, while good in the short term, opens up the greater possibilities that he's not going to be a lifelong Met. And that's okay as long as the Mets get better. The connection of Vladimir Guerrero Jr., though, and look, Kendrick did not refer to trading for him because I think he knows better. The trading for Vladimir Guerrero Jr. thing, though, it needs to stop. Because as of right now, the Blue Jays have shown no inclination to being open to trading him. There's no reason for them to be open to trading him. And that is literally talking about a guy who's a free agent at the end of next season. And there's going to be a lot of options. And there's going to be options that we're not even thinking of. We're not even thinking about the kid from Japan, Murakami, who could play third base or first base. You know what else we're not thinking about? Can I say something really positive here in the middle of January? We're not thinking about the possibility that, like, Mark Vientos came into our life as a star. We knew Mark Vientos a year ago, but what were we saying about him a year ago? What were we saying about him? If you go back into the middle of January, we were saying he'll compete maybe to be on this roster. None of us wanted to guarantee him at bats. I was sitting here arguing, go get me another bat. And yeah, maybe him and Brett Beatty can steal some at bats at third base or DH. We'll see what happens. Mark Vientos then, it took a while, goes out, has this incredible year, and now we all write him in as the guy protecting Juan Soto, or maybe hitting two spots after Juan Soto. So I say this to you positively. Maybe next January, we're talking about Ronnie Mauricio as the third baseman. He's got to be the everyday third baseman. And Mark Vientos shifting over to first base. Maybe that's what we're talking about. Or maybe Brett Beatty, believe it or not, shockingly puts together a big year. Maybe one of the younger players that we're high on, Jet Williams, Luis Angel Acuna, maybe even Ryan Clifford gets here earlier than we think. So what we're going to say a year from now about Alonso and Guerrero and free agency, to be determined. That's for sure. Keith writes, first off, thank you. I'm probably unhealthily addicted to the Mets, and your podcast gives me 2 fixes a week during a long and cold offseason. We appreciate that. I would say that during this offseason, it's been more like 3 or 4 doses per week. This has been a shortish week, but for the most part, we're giving you like 3 or 4 bangs a week, aren't we? Anyhow, Keith writes, the Jim Duquette Pete Alonso report confuses me. The Mets want Pete back on a short-term deal. Duquette is reporting that Pete will only take a short-term deal from the Mets. If this is all true, why isn't a deal done? I can't imagine they're that far apart on dollars, so that Boras leaked this as a way to pressure other teams to step up. I feel like if this report is true and an agreement isn't reached within a week or so, there may be a good chance that David Stearns doesn't really want Pete back and has other plans to fill out the roster. Curious of your thoughts on my theory. I'll stop typing and listen. Well, thank you very much. I think you've hit a couple. Number one, I think Scott Boras will always put stuff out to try to improve his position. So while I believe the story is probably true, I think you're right. I think if you're the Giants or you're the Angels or your team that's interested, because I don't know if those teams are interested. Those are just reports that have been out there. But if you are a team on the periphery of Pete Alonso and you hear this, you may reach out yourself saying, oh, okay, well, we'd be interested in a short-term deal. You're going to ignore the part where it's exclusively to the Mets. And if you're Scott, you're not going to hang up on them. And you're going to see, all right, what is out there. Maybe this is going to somehow heat up his market. So I do think it's kind of like when you're buying a house and maybe sometimes the realtor will tell you, actually sell the house as asking price, make it really low so it'll turn into a bidding war and then the price will come up to what we really want. So I think that could be a factor. That's number one. Number two, why isn't it done yet? AAV. Just because Scott says, all right, guys, we're going to give you what you want on a short-term contract, knowing Scott Boras, he's probably asking for $50 million a year, and the Mets aren't just going to give him that. They're going to say, no, we're going to give you $27 million a year and negotiate from there.
What's crazy is, again, this whole thing about the market, right? That's part of it. Like, look at Pete Alonso's market. What are the numbers saying? Vladimir Jr. just got his arbitration. It was 28.5, right? So maybe the market's closer to that. But how about Juan Soto? What was the market on him? They just dealt with Scott Boras.
Well, the market was you had a bunch of teams bidding on him. That was the market.
I get it, but for people that's saying, well, you can't spend $50 million a year on Pete Alonso, even if it's in a short term. But you couldn't do that for Juan Soto either because there was
but the difference is what I just said. You had multiple teams bidding on him, which drove the price up. If right now it's just the Mets talking to Scott about a Pete Alonso contract, you're bidding against yourselves. Why would you go to $50 million when right now you're going to do it based on, okay, Freddie Freeman makes this amount of money, Miguel Cabrera made that amount of money, Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is now going to make this amount of money. It's not a bidding war. That the reason the Soto number got so high is it was a bidding war. This is not a bidding war.
Yeah, again, I don't disagree with you, and that's the whole thing about like Pete Alonso in general. Like when people said, "Oh, we don't want," there's no way that Pete Alonso is Aaron Judge. He's not going to get the Aaron Judge money. Pete Alonso never asked for the Aaron Judge money. He asked for $200 million, right? So like the market, what I understand, there's no bidding war going on because nobody's quote unquote interested. Obviously, maybe with this now, with a 3-year deal on the table, maybe teams are going to be invested in it. But again, we're talking about the Mets who just went above and beyond for one player. True, Steve Cohen probably had a lot of influence, said that let's go get the player, make sure we can't miss it. But if they want Pete Alonso, why don't they just do it? Especially now with 3-year deal.
I love you, and people usually say this to me, and now I'm going to get to say this to you. You would be a terrible negotiator.
Oh, I'm awful.
And I've heard people say that to me, like, oh, God, Evan, you'd be the worst negotiator. I think that right now, the New York Mets are bidding amongst themselves, and they're deciding, and this is the decision they have to make. Do we want to risk pushing this thing further and having Scott shop short-term deals to numerous other teams, or are we confident, you know what, he's got nothing, and we'll live with the consequences if he does have something? But there's no reason to just hand them $40 million a year. They don't have
but hold on, though. Let's be serious. And I know this wasn't David Stearns. This is Billy Epler. But who was giving Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander those type of contracts? 3 years, $100+ million at those moments.
Well, in Scherzer's case, the Dodgers. I think the Dodgers were trying to re-sign him, and they had made big offers to him. There was I don't want to say there was a bidding war for both of those guys, but there was a market for both of those guys. Right now, and I hope I'm not going to live to regret this. I hope the Mets aren't going to live to regret this. There doesn't appear to be any market for Pete Alonso.
So what? He's going to go to Korea, the KBO?
No. I think that the Mets are – look, our last emailer, Keith, says, what's the holdup? The holdup is Scott Boras has probably said, okay, we'll go on a short-term deal. We want $50 million a year. Yes. And the Mets aren't just going to give Pete Alonso $50 million a year. They're not going to give him $40 million a year. If I had to guess right now, I think this ends at $30 or $31 million a year. My guess is this. You know what my guess is? My guess is 3-year contract, opt out after year 1 or year 2. Year 1 is 30, year 2 is 27, and year 3 is 25. What are you rolling your eyes about? Is that a bad offer?
I don't think he's going to sign that. I don't think he's going to sign that. Well, and you're talking about, and I can't, because here's the thing is, again, you're talking about a guy who's going to break the home run record for the Mets this year if he comes back. And you could find other ways to give bonuses and pay him off somewhere else. Like, is the bonus affected the AAV?
I think they do, actually. Yeah, I think they incorporate them when they. In fact, Bill Madden was reporting with the Juan Soto contract that all of the luxury suites and the closed deals, which I don't even know if that was true, that would affect the AAV as well. That they really are careful to make sure that the AAV is accurate, so there's no way to circumvent it. Because otherwise, hey, I'd circumvent it. I'll give you 50 suites that are worth, $10 million as extra money. But I think as a Met fan, what I would say is I feel decent they're going to bring him back. I feel decent that this may not stretch spring training as I had thought. But, until it's done, until you see Jeff Passan, because he's the ultimate guy, saying it is a done deal, the Mets and Pete Alonso have agreed to a brand new blah, blah, blah contract for blah, blah, blah millions of dollars, you always have that little bit of worry in your brain. A little bit of worry. We do appreciate the emails. You can email us, thericob@gmail.com. We'll get back on track with a lot of Ricos coming up. We're going to explore the first year of Carlos Mendoza. We're bringing back the Killer series. We're going to bring in a Met killer and have a nice conversation with said killer coming up real soon. Not going to reveal who that killer is. I know for some of you, you're going to skip that edition of the Rico. That is totally fine. And coming up in a few weeks, we will have a full recap on our Rico rewatch of opening day 1985 between the New York Mets and the St. Louis Cardinals. Again, rate, download, subscribe to Rico Brogna. We always appreciate your support. Thank you very much for listening to Rico Brogna.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Rico Brogna podcast. It's amazing, isn't it? Make sure you download it now to keep it on you at all times.